I'd love to see us making a real dent in biodiversity loss and see money flowing in to protect nature, not just because it's the right thing to do, because actually nature is a brilliant way to capture carbon.
Those most vulnerable are living on the edge of the climate crisis. We need to make sure that we look after those people and put them first.
A better understanding of the urgency, I think that's hugely important. This will be my 5th COP, and I think in the last 5 years it's really ratcheted up. And I think that all sectors, including banking for that matter, really need to get on board with that.
We have a carbon neutral roadmap, which is the commitments are reducing our emissions by 68% by 2030, net zero by 2050. How do we fund that?
If people start to take the steps, if businesses, organisations, governments start to take the tough decisions, make the tough choices, we can save the planet and we can build a better planet for the future. But it means making real tough decisions.
This panel is going to be talking about green finance, how the UK is developing and implementing innovative financial solutions. We'll also cover the scepticism around nature-based solutions, the accusations of greenwashing. But first of all, as I did before, I'd like to just ask each panellist to introduce themselves. And if you were at COP, or even if you weren't, what were your takeaways from this COP and going into the next year? Tom.
So I'm Tom Gegg. I work at Palladium, which has a partnership with the UK's national parks to catalyse investment into restoring nature across the parks. I wasn't at COP, but for me, the most interesting thing that happened there was the Breakthrough Agenda, which was actually launched in Glasgow last year, which is all about how can we catalyse tipping points by massively scaling up green climate tech like heat pumps, wind turbines, electric cars. And I think some of the ideas around how to create this change and really accelerate scale up are exciting.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Heather Mckay, and I lead the UK finance team at E3G. And E3G is a climate policy think tank with another acronym for you all to remember at the end of this. I do apologise for my voice, as well as a Glaswegian accent. I've had a cold for the past few days, so just put your hand up if you can't understand me, and then I'll just ignore you. So I actually wasn't at COP either, but I was following closely from home, and I think I've got 2 real takeaways from COP this year. I think firstly, there really seems to be quite a significant level of recognition about the need to change the way that we think about finance. So a number of high-level bodies, including the High-Level Expert Group and the UN Secretary General, called for high credibility non-greenwash commitments from the private sector and set out some guidance for that. The Transition Plan Task Force that Brendan mentioned earlier also did a very similar thing. And Songway and Stern came out and really called for the fact that we have to really change the financial architecture by which we allocate capital and assess risk to account for climate. I think the other thing I'd mention is that there were a number of high-level commitments on nature as well. So, and there's so many acronyms, but it's the Forest and Climate Leadership Partnership was launched to tackle deforestation, which is great. The Loss and Damage Fund was launched. There's no detail yet. There's no money in it yet, apart from Scotland. So, but it's a really positive step to recognising the fact we do have to start accounting for the impacts of climate change that are happening now.
There were pledges, though, weren't there?
Pledges.
Right, but no actual dosh.
Yeah,
okay,
I think there's a lot of rhetoric, as we see a lot, and a lot of pledging, but we need to actually start to think about the ways we get money on the table. And I think the final thing I'll say that I was really pleased with at COP was actually our COP president, Alok Sharma, said at this opening of the UK Pavilion event that without finance, nothing that we need to get done will get done. And actually, I took that really to heart. And I think it's really G'd me up after a long year.
Thanks. I'm Maggie Fitzherbert, and when I'm not dropping things out of my pockets on stage, I'm advisory manager at ZSL, Zoological Society of London. We're a global conservation NGO, and we have a programme of sustainable business and finance, which is where I sit. And we are looking at ways in which the private sector and the finance sector are impacting climate and biodiversity. So we're looking at things like biodiversity performance within investment funds, and also how kind of supply chain dynamics are driving land use change and biodiversity as well. So we had a presence at COP. I personally wasn't there, but we had representatives from our policy team and also from the Institute of Zoology, which is our academic branch. And having spoken to them in the sort of preparations for this, the main take-homes are around the fact that the biodiversity and the climate conversations are still happening in silos and they're not integrated. We've been pushing for years to have these two different subjects kind of come together for solutions that cover both. And although there was kind of some of the right noises being made, it wasn't really integrated into the policies, into the pledges and into the mechanisms. So I think there's still quite a long way to go in that respect. It's been said before that what's good for biodiversity is also good for climate, and the same isn't necessarily true the other way around. So as we'll come to more when we're talking about nature-based solutions, we can't just be focusing on carbon with regards to nature-based solutions. We need to be looking at the role that they play in the broader landscape restoration, ecosystem restoration, which will have benefits across society, economies, and also the sort of need to improve biodiversity to sustain all of the futures of people and economies. So with that, I'll pass it back.
Heather, you referenced the COP president, Alex Sharma, there, and another thing he said was that this is the decade that represents that critical window, and he actually talked about an interdependent biodiversity, land degradation, and the climate crises. How do you see nature-based solutions fitting into that path to net zero?
Well, I have to say, I think you covered it really, you started the conversation off really well, because our entire economy is predicated on a stable climate and a stable environment around us. And actually, a lot of the ways we've been pricing in risk haven't accounted for that. So now I think that, we're really seeing a turn of the dial at the moment in recognition of the fact that we have to start thinking about the climate in which our financial system exists, in order to ensure its longevity and productivity. And I've forgotten the second half of your question.
It was how do you see nature-based solutions fitting into that path?
Well, I think, again, I agree with you that nature-based solutions are one aspect of how we need to protect nature. I think that it's evident, some estimates say that looking at the UK, we need to scale up finance to about 5.6 billion every single year to protect the environment. And I think we all can appreciate that's not all going to come from the state. It's just not possible after the constrained fiscal environments that most economies are finding themselves in now after the Ukraine and Russia war and the COVID pandemic. So we need to start thinking about blended finance, and we need to start thinking about the signals that we're giving to the market to scale up private investment. And I think that's where nature-based solutions fit in. The government basically needs to consider the entire toolkit it has at its disposal to protect the environment. So not all environmental causes and issues can actually wait for markets to scale up. But if we're going to start mobilising finance at scale, I think nature-based solutions and creating markets around those will be incredibly critical to protecting the planet.
You mentioned blended finance there, and I know, Tom, Palladium did a really interesting project, Revere, where you teamed up with UK national parks to restore natural habitats with private capital. Can you tell us a little bit more about that framework and the kind of responsibility for financing nature-based solutions?
I think blended finance on the investment side is part of the solution. It certainly helps to de-risk the investment opportunities for private investors when you have, first loss capital from government funding, for example. But that's only one part of it. Yeah, there needs to be a pipeline of risky things to invest in to then reassure the private investors that they're not going to be as risky as they thought. And at the moment, that pipeline is not really there. And it's because we've gone through, I would say there are kind of three phases to how nature has been financed in the UK. And for most of the time, nature has been financed by government grants and charitable donations to NGOs or to national park authorities. And so you get a slug of money and you use that to protect wetland or create new woodlands. And it hasn't really worked. It's been massively overwhelmed by finance in the other direction for agricultural subsidies. And now we have a second phase, which has taken off in the last few years, which is that you can now value and monetize and trade ecosystem services like carbon credits or credits representing water quality or biodiversity, which is really exciting. But still, fundamentally, what we're seeing is projects are now financed by government grants or charitable donations, covering about 80 to 90% of the costs. But as a bonus, you can sell carbon credits, which is fantastic. And maybe they'll cover your maintenance costs and generate a profit. Great. But if you took away the government grants, the whole house of cards falls down immediately. And so I think a lot of the noise in this sector at the moment fails to acknowledge the fact that the government's still paying for nearly everything. And then there's all of this language around private investment and nature-based solutions. And when people talk about this, what they're incorrectly describing as investment is actually corporates buying carbon credits. But that's, those are customers. They're buying your services or products. They're not actually investing the upfront capital required to make a project begin. That's still the government. So I would say the third phase of actually investing in nature-based solutions is to rethink completely how these projects are planned and managed, designed, financed. And I think that's possible now because we can feel more secure in the fact that there is a market for these ecosystem services and you can generate revenues. So for me personally, I think this needs to end up looking like the things that bankers would be much more familiar with financing, so infrastructure projects. You would create a special purpose vehicle, and instead of it being for a bridge or an office block, it's actually for 5,000 hectares of broadleaf woodland in Yorkshire, and it requires £25 million worth of capital up front that will be paid back over 10 years through a loan, and the revenues come from selling carbon credits, and you've got agreements with a portfolio of landowners, and it just starts looking a lot more like something that you would normally invest in. And then you can bring in the blended finance to say, okay, investors are interested, but they're worried. Let's use some government money to de-risk it. Or let's use government money more wisely to stabilize the revenue side in case the carbon market isn't predictable enough. But we need to move away from this reliance on upfront government grants, which really is, it's never going to cover the 5.6 billion a year.
I think in terms of that phase 3, another thing we need to add in is how it's communicated, which is where a business like SEC Newgate and our Green and Good team come in. And the communication piece, I feel, is so important now because there is so much skepticism about this. So Maggie, from your point of view, how can we combat that skepticism and lead that kind of journey of communication to investors and to the wider public?
Well, I think to combat the skepticism, we need to face it head on because a certain amount of it is legitimate. And so to have nature-based solutions without decarbonising an economy is quite rightly labelled as greenwashing, as is nature-based solutions which might sequester carbon but lead to ecological harm. That's also greenwashing. And so unless we have a framework whereby we have safeguards in place where nature-based solutions are not only preventing other types of harm, but are providing co-benefits, then that skepticism is going to continue, and that's going to continue to be a barrier to investment as well. The other element of it as well, back to the kind of social justice kind of conversation, is that nature-based solutions or any kind of projects like this take land. And to look at this at a global scale, the pressure on land is enormous. And if you're looking at setting aside areas, parcels of land to sequester carbon, and that comes at the cost of other types of land use, such as urbanisation or agricultural uses, then you're just going to displace the pressure, and you could inadvertently lead to more carbon emissions from land use change elsewhere. So I think that beyond a communication piece, there's actually some work to be done around the framework on this, and to put in place those safeguards, which was another thing missing at COP. And to have those safeguards, you also need transparency and accountability. And there's not necessarily frameworks for that either. So there's quite a lot of different things which are missing before this can really reach its full potential. And the potential is enormous. The potential reaches beyond carbon, it reaches beyond financial returns. But there's lots of different dots which need to be joined together, and that can apply at a local scale, a national scale, or a global scale. So I think that that's something which I'd really like to see a bit more focus on before we can say nature-based solutions is free of greenwash.
Heather, From an E3G perspective, is that framework piece something that you guys are looking at, working on?
Yeah, so some of my colleagues are following that really closely, and I do completely agree as well. I think that for too long, offsets have been far too cheaply priced, so they don't incentivise actual action, and they're low quality because there aren't clear guidelines on what is good and what isn't when it comes to an offset. So I feel like someone's in the audience is going to correct me on this, but there's like about 3 or 4 principles that offsets should basically follow for nature-based solutions. Additional, permanent, transparent and credible, and there probably is others, so correct me after. But I think it speaks to what you're saying, that we need to really start to bulk out the accountability in this sector. I think there's a couple of things going on in terms of offsets that are probably of interest to some of you in the audience. Then there's 2 major initiatives, and I'm going to get the names wrong, but the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which really focuses on the kind of demand side and limitations on how companies can reach net zero and the extent to which they can use offsets. And this is the one I always get wrong, the integrity...
British Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets.
I'm so glad you're here, Naomi.
ICBCM, I think.
Yeah, and that's...
I've revised all of those acronyms.
So, I mean, you can also tell the audience as well, but that one's really more on the supply side. And I think together, those are really interesting initiatives. And I think we need, basically, again, we can't have this vast proliferation of different standards that makes it even more of a headache than it was in the first place to understand what's good and what isn't. We need interoperability amongst standards, and we need a common understanding of what is good and what isn't. And I think the final thing I'll say is also that there's another aspect where, you know, if a company's buying a high quality offset, but the damage that they've done is by knocking down Brazilian rainforest that was there for thousands of years and it's killing biodiversity, that's not a direct offset for the impact of that decision-making or that supply chain. So I think we also need to extend those principles beyond mitigation and actually think about the whole of environment impact of supply chain decisions.
Great, thank you. Questions from the audience, please. I think Al has the mic. Yes, please. Lucy Johnson.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Lucy Johnson from Green Salon. It really got me thinking when you were talking about revenue generating, because of course the problem with nature is that we chop it down and we kind of exploit it because it's cheaper to do that. So when we're thinking about revenue generating, of course there is the carbon offsetting, but I'm also thinking about ways in which we can regenerate nature through business. I'm thinking about regenerative agriculture, etc., about ways of making nature profitable, which is what we like to see as human beings. And I wonder whether you feel that there's sort of space within that with regenerative agriculture, ways of bringing nature back into play through making it more economically viable, as it were.
Who's it to? Or can I choose?
All of you.
Okay. Maggie, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think that we need to put values on different types of ecosystem services in a way which is much more sophisticated than what we're doing now. And in the example of regenerative agriculture, if you look at something like agroforestry, you have the additional carbon benefits, but you also have benefits around soil protection. Crops are protected from floods, from droughts. You have increased biodiversity, which will also lead to better pest control and pollination. All of these things have an economic value as well as intrinsic value. And so if we can start kind of costing those up, then we can actually find who are the beneficiaries of those and bring them into the funding conversation and bring them into the business models. So if we start stacking benefits on projects, we've got a project, the River Crane in the UK, of a restoration project, and we're exploring a way where we can have a business model whereby we kind of gather data and map the impacts for flood alleviation, for biodiversity net gain, as well as water filtration, and we can bring the water boards in, the developers in, and so on, to actually start making much more sophisticated business models which are more resilient to fluctuations in the carbon market, but also mean that you address that challenge of scale. So you can't really have a scaled project which is funded just on carbon credits. If you have nature-based solutions with all these co-benefits, then you can bring that concentration of capital into projects on a much smaller scale. So I think there's enormous potential there. But again, the frameworks aren't there, the standards aren't there. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get that science in the heart of that, because at the moment, it's just at the early stages, but it's really exciting space. So good question, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave the kind of the finance detail to you afterwards if you'd like to come in. But I think for me, again, it builds on from what I was saying at the end of my last set of remarks. Offsets and nature-based solutions shouldn't just be about minimising the negative and creating a neutral situation. They can often be about enhancing the way we live our lives and the solutions we use, and enhancing and protecting the environment as well. And I think that that's very much a principle that should be baked into nature-based solutions, is it's not just about making sure we're doing everything in a neutral way. It's actually about making sure we're doing things in a new, exciting and visionary way.
Over to you.
What do I think? We've worked with quite a lot of different business models in the tropics, aiming to get green commodities out of rainforests in places like Indonesia or Colombia or Brazil, and generate revenues for communities that live in forests that can compete with the industries that are making a lot of money from cutting these forests down. And it's basically really hard to compete. And it's super hard to compete with, I don't know, say you're getting oils out of nuts that grow wild in Borneo, and actually you can do quite well out of those. You can process it into a nut butter, and then that goes into cosmetics. So one of the businesses we worked in now supplies Lush, and this really rare oil goes into a lot of Lush cosmetics, which is great. Can it compete with a palm oil plantation business model? Probably not. Why is that? Because palm oil is really well subsidized. And so firstly, the governments around the world need to stop subsidizing the wrong thing and start subsidizing the right thing. And then, I think it's like these guys said, you need to, yes, you can sell products, but if those products, their true value is not just in the product itself, but in the ecosystem services that it generates alongside it, then you need to value those. And either you sell the two things separately. Here's my nut oil for Lush, and here is my carbon credit that represents the rainforest I've saved by doing this business model, then fine. Or you could bundle the two together and say, here is the premium I'm charging for these cosmetics because of the impact they've had on the climate.
Yes. One moment, there's a mic.
Thank you so much. So I'm Sarisha, I work for BNP Paribas, and I think one thing that's quite interesting as an observation is the trajectory that net zero has taken within sustainable finance versus nature. And I think that I wondered, two questions really. One is on the product innovation side, and I guess this is more for Palladium, because I think often people are focusing on the idea of carbon credits, but actually there's no reason at all why we can't look at what's been done in capital markets and replicate that for use of proceeds and KPIs that are much more focused on biodiversity. But tangential to that, I feel like there's, and it's a question more, I guess, for the scientific side of the team, do you think that we need a kind of taxonomy for nature? Because I think if we look at the momentum that we've seen in terms of sustainable finance towards net zero, so much of that momentum was cemented by investors feeling clarity and much more comfort in definitions on what was actually considered green. But it feels like there's a lot of subjectivity in terms of the nature metrics that exist. And there's also this issue around the product innovation potentially being quite unambitious currently in the market.
Sarisha, I'm so pleased that you said taxonomy. It was on the tip of my tongue. Tom, first question to you.
I don't know whether it's... I think there probably is a role for innovation in financing around how you recognize and value biodiversity. And I think it's not really my area. I would say I'd see a stronger role for regulation, really. I think a lot of the innovation needs to be around the project development side. So how do you actually create... I think there's a lot of noise in the finance sector at the moment around investing in nature-based solutions and these new products and these new metrics, and there's a huge amount of noise around ESG. But really, there just isn't this pipeline of projects to invest in. So you can innovate as much as you like on the finance side, but if you actually want to get finance into restoring nature, then there needs to be this kind of group of organizations that are willing to actually develop projects that are high integrity, that work, that are understandable by the finance sector. And for me, that is where the innovation needs to happen. And at the moment, there's this gulf between, the wildlife trusts or RSPB and then BNP Paribas, and how do the two meet in the middle, and how could BNP Paribas lend millions to one of these NGOs? And it's still quite far apart.
And who was it to Heather? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, really, Yeah, really interesting question. I'm sure you'll add some very interesting stuff on top. But I'll touch on the first one and then I'll go into detail on the second one. So I think you're right about the kind of, when you said regulation, I think that's something that's a really interesting thing to remember is not all of the solutions that are needed around nature and biodiversity preservation are going to happen through the use of offsets and carbon markets. We also need different tools at our government's disposal to be deployed to support nature. And I think that holistic view of the types of government intervention needs to be remembered, because I know there are a number of people who really truly believe that disclosures are the only way forward, and that's all you need. But I am here as a heretic to tell you that I don't agree with that. And we also need things like strategic public investment to de-risk spaces. We need strong regulation. We need policy signals. We need sectoral roadmaps, and all of that needs to have some sort of overarching vision, a purse to hold the pennies in so they make a pound, so to speak, to ensure they actually have the impact that is desired. And I think actually the UK Infrastructure Bank, I know you're working on that as well, but it's a really interesting new institution that has nature as one of its infrastructure focuses. And I'm really excited to see what they do in terms of showcasing the best ways to demonstrate and create and support market growth and create value as well. Leads me nicely on to financial tools and taxonomy. So obviously the EU has its own taxonomy that it's published, and the UK has intended to publish its own. We have seen hide no tail of that yet, so fingers crossed it does come out. But within the taxonomy as it stands, there are some, through the 6 categories that the taxonomy has on kind of environmental protection, nature and biodiversity can be included within that. I'd say that it's not the only tool we should be using. I mean, a taxonomy is ultimately just a static look at what's green and what isn't. We need things like transition tools that are more dynamic, principles, for example, that help us set guardrails, yes, on what is good and what isn't at the time being, and what might be good and what isn't in 5 years' time. But also other tools to come into play to also support companies in integrating nature within their financial decision making. So I'm thinking of the transition plans requirements that the UK has been very world leading in making mandatory as of COP26. They've just published a consultation, currently don't include nature, I would say meaningfully, but I think that that's a perfect tool to allow companies to kind of incorporate the very holistic and dynamic nature of supporting, I said nature twice, nature of supporting nature. And I think that we should think about how we integrate nature more firmly into decision making through other metrics beyond the taxonomy, because I just don't think I think the taxonomy is really it's like a dictionary. It's not in itself a call to action or a holistic approach.
I'm going to take the final question, and then I'm going to ask Heather to come up to close for us before we pop upstairs. And it's one that I think we all should and are thinking about, but for each of you, what will you tell your children that you did to address climate change? Tom, I'll start with you. You said first of all I have to get a girlfriend, because I said grandchildren, and I modified it now for him to children.
I think I don't know about this. I think this. A lot of people say when they're asked why are you getting involved in trying to prevent climate change now, and they say, oh, it's because of my children or my grandchildren, and I need to be able to look them in the eye. But what about now? You know, it's happening right now. What about
the well-being of your future girlfriend?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's not this. It's
that
no
was
longer
a
this
mic
distant
drop.
problem.
That was a mic drop.
Should I just leave?
Yeah, it's no longer a distant problem that's going to be a problem for our kids or our grandchildren. We really need to do something about this right now.
Okay, Heather.
So apart from making bad jokes on panels and recovering from my cold by watching reruns of Emily in Paris all week, I think for me, I come back to what Alok Sharma said at COP. It's making sure we have the finance to make sure the stuff that needs to happen gets done. So I very much see that is my kind of swan song, is what I would say to my grandchildren. And over the next year, I really want my team, some of whom are in the audience, to really be focused, and I know the other colleagues we work with who are amazing, and they're in the room, from all different NGOs and businesses and private sector companies, to focus on thinking about that financial architecture piece. What do we have to do to build the purse that all the pennies sit in? If you know the phrase, look after the pennies and the pounds look after themselves. I think we really need to think about that kind of systemic approach and use next year's COP. Yes, COPs can't do everything, and yes, there's frustrations at COPs, but use next year's COP to really push for a conversation about 2.1c, Article 2.1c, which is about how we reorientate global financial flows in line with net zero. And again, make the case that it's not just about net zero, it's about net zero and nature too. So that's what I'd do.
It's a difficult one, and I've had the longest to think about it. But I mean, aside from just saying, go and ask your grandparents and your great-grandparents, I'd like to think that what myself and people in my sort of sphere of influence can bring to the table is to try and firstly be putting that science at the heart of the decision making, and also bringing different influences around the table. So historically within conservation there's been quite a kind of anti-finance, anti-business movement, and I think that's gradually changing. There's still lots of place for that advocacy, for that critical voice, but actually to start trying to put in the same room the people that have the power to actually make the change, because none of these different sectors are going to make them on their own. The finance isn't going to make them on their own, neither are the conservationists. And together, I think that there is some real potential for change, but there needs to be more collaboration, there needs to be more multi-stakeholder platforms, and that's a really complicated thing to try and achieve. Everyone loves these idea of collaborative multi-stakeholder platforms. They're really hard, they're really slow, and that's something which I think hopefully is something that me and my team are working towards in a positive sense, but time will tell.
Mummy, what's a multi-collaborative stakeholder platform? No, you don't have to tell me that.
We get the textbook.
So thank you very much to our panellists, and it just leaves me to bring Heather up onto the stage. Thank you.
So first and foremost, thanks so much for all of our fantastic panellists and everybody for joining us. It's been a fantastic thing to have a bit of a wash-up after COP, because it was a mildly chaotic and frenetic time, to say the least. But I think the big thing, and this really kind of just goes on the last points, the collaboration is absolutely what we're focusing on right now. And so I would just say, for a bit of a call to action, everyone in the room that's not involved, please get involved. We've, whether it's on the SME work stream or just bringing everybody together, this absolutely cannot happen unless we all work together. And so it's really exciting. And I'm just grateful that we've got such a great group of people that are really working on the right things. So thank you.